What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Early Read Conference Preview Series rolling on here. And we move now out of the Power Five and into the Group of Five. And it is the Mountain West we're doing today. And to do that, somebody I found last year, when digging through the college football space, I found his Substack, really great in-depth breakdowns on player evaluation on the fantasy side of things. And I think that there's plenty of betting application as well. It is Volume Pig. Justin joins the show. You can follow him on Twitter at Volume Pig. He does work on, of course, his Substack Volume Pig, and also Campus to Can, Fan Tracks, and helps out with the Chasing the Natty podcast. Volume Pig. Justin, how's it going, man?
Yeah, man, great. Thank you for the great intro there. Excited to get into it today. And again, thanks for asking me to come on your show.
Of course. So let's start at the top, because I see in a lot of the early summer publications, prognostications, that Boise State is the best Group of Five team in the country. They are going to be in this expanded college football playoff. They're going to be the at-large or the Group of Five bid team. They are plus 490 to make the college football playoff at FanDuel. Their win total is 9.5. They are the short shot to win the Mountain West inside of 2-1. So, Justin, my question to you is this. I think we could agree that Boise State is the best team on paper. Do you see it coming to fruition that this team that struggled at points last season before firing head coach Andy Avalos is going to actually come through on this expectation? Again, win total of 9.5.
Yeah, well, Boise's always a good bet in the Group of Five, specifically within their own conference. They're always a tough team. One of the top teams within the Mountain West year in, year out. They've been one of the more consistent Group of Five teams for, decade plus now. Obviously, everybody knows the tailback, Ashton Jeanty. That's sort of where it begins and ends with them, especially on offense, is that ground game was very effective last year. They've got other running backs behind Jeanty as well, and that really is the emphasis on offense. We don't really know what to make of their passing game. I don't know if they're really going to be completing a lot of forward passes this year or attempting to. But they did bring in former five-star just from a year ago, former USC recruit Malachi Nelson at quarterback. But Boise is always one of the more talented teams within their conference, certainly within the G5. They're a logical sort of betting favorite as the G5 at-large team. Of course, we know with the expanded playoff now, there is a spot reserved for G5 teams. If you're looking at sort of G5 teams this year, and again, we're going to talk about some others, Boise certainly is one of those that immediately comes to mind. USF would be another one, some of these other teams in other conferences. But Boise State, year in, year out, they are a favorite in their conference. They generally show up and produce pretty well. Coaching changed last year, despite the fact that they still won their conference. That kind of tells you what the expectations are over there, what their standards are, as they were firing their staff mid-season and they still won their conference. That's a program. They've been successful, and they generally are more talented than all of the other programs within their conference.
Yeah, Boise, it was an interesting year last year. They fire Avalos. They start 4-5 on the year and really couldn't get out of their own way. Mm-hmm. They lose to Fresno, and then they turn around and they blitz their remaining 4 games, including the Mountain West Championship game against UNLV. They absolutely smoke them.
Yep.
I understand why they're the favorite on paper heading into the season, but I'm not sold all the way. You mentioned maybe some questions at quarterback. It seems, reading the reports, that it is going to be Malachi Nelson that takes over. Madsen is also back, but I think that's a guy who traded time with Taylor Green, who transferred to Arkansas, and looks like he's going to be the starter there while Arkansas is down. I think that shows that Taylor Green is clearly a above average to elite G5 quarterback that he's transferring to Arkansas and starting. So I see that as, Nelson, maybe he comes through as a 5-star, but I think it's fair to have questions about the quarterback play. You mentioned Jeanty, a lot of turnover at wide receiver, lose some studs on the offensive line. So I think the offense has a very high floor. I just wonder if they're going to be smooth sailing the rest of the way. Of course, you could just hand it to Jeanty every time and it may not matter, but I think there's some concern. You look on the defense side of the ball, they are second in the country in returning production. All 4 starters on the defensive line, Oladipo back at linebacker. So, again, this team makes sense to me as the favorite to win the conference. I'm not laying the short number, though, just because I still think there's more questions than you'd like for a team that you'd be betting this early to win the conference. I think that there will be other opportunities to bet. You'll look at the schedule. I wouldn't say it's the easiest schedule, there are some difficult matchups. I mean, first of all, they play at Oregon in week 2. That's no fun. At Georgia Southern, a high-powered offense in week 1. They're big favorites there, but I think that could be a questionable matchup. You go through the Mountain West schedule. They do take a road trip to Hawaii. They come out of a bye to play at UNLV, who's you'd call them top 3 team in the conference. They also take a late season trip at to Laramie to take on Wyoming. And they play both of the PAC-2 teams in Washington State and Oregon State. So I think there's fair to have some questions here about this Boise State schedule. Are they probably going to make the championship game? Yes. But I do think that there are some questions about their upside. Any thoughts about Boise State as a whole here before we move on to the next team?
Those are all fair concerns. And yeah, I think we're both aligned there in terms of question marks with the passing game, right? I mean, I don't think anybody's questioning how effective are they going to be on the ground. But if they happen to find themselves playing from behind some games, especially if they're playing against other high-powered passing attacks, and the ground game maybe isn't as effective as it normally is, are they going to be able to keep up with a UNLV, for example? This is a fair concern. But again, when you look sort of to the rest of that conference, right? I mean, you're looking at, sure, UNLV is still there. They return a lot. You look at Fresno State. And again, I know we're going to talk about some of these teams as well. But, you sort of compare Boise State. Yes, there's some concerns. But basically everybody else also has quite a few concerns, right? And so the schedule is a fair point. It's never fun taking a road trip to Hawaii, but Boise State consistently, I mean, they've always sort of showed up, and that staff, the OC who's there, it's a new OC technically, but he was there back in 2022. So they've got a lot of familiarity there, and there is some turnover on offense, and yeah, I mean, question marks on with the passing attack for sure. That's a fair concern. I share that concern as well.
Yeah, Boise State last year, 32nd in EPA per pass. So I think expecting that to be the same is, asking for a lot. And also the defense, while they do return a lot, 85th in EPA per play last season, and that's with DC Spencer Danielson becoming the head coach. So we'll see. As Justin mentioned, Dirk Cutter returns. He was a coach for Boise back in the day. Was OC 2 years ago, is the OC yet again. So Boise, again, rightfully the favorite. I'm not like sold all the way surefire this team will be the G5 college football playoff team. Like some people are hinting towards. The team I'm much higher on is Fresno State, win total of 7.5, about 360 to win the conference. Team tailed off at the end of the season due to injury. But to be fair, especially on the defense side of the ball, they were replacing a ton of production last season. And again, transfer quarterback Mikey Keene, who really acquitted himself nicely in the Mountain West. He got hurt with a concussion at the end of the year. There's a lot back here, though, including Keene. Sherrod's back at running back. He's an 1,000-yard rusher. James and Sharp come from the FCS ranks. Each had over 1,000 yards. Jalen Moss will likely step in as the bell cow wide receiver this season. 4 starters back on the offensive line. I think there's a lot to like about this Fresno State offense. Defense, again, last year they didn't have a lot of RP. This year they do. And last year they still were an above average defense in terms of EPA per play. So Justin, are you with me that you're bullish on the Bulldogs in 2024?
Yeah, well, anytime you have sort of returning starting quarterback, returning tailback, who was sort of the bell cow or the volume pig last year, if I can plug that you have returning wide receivers. So there are quite a few receivers who left. They were primarily sort of slot receivers. Eric Brooks was one. There's another whose name is escaping me, former Ohio State receiver. Jalen Gilt, that's the other one. But they are returning Jalen Moss, as you mentioned. He's their lead returning receiver. They brought in 2 from the FCS, Shadon James, Raylan Sharp, as you mentioned. And there's others that also returned. In Josiah Freeman, he was a productive JUCO receiver a year before. There was a lot of excitement within the CFF community last offseason about him. People are still sort of holding their breath that maybe this is the year he breaks through. Mac Delana is another receiver who returns. So anytime you have starting quarterback return, starting tailback, you got some nice continuity at wide receiver, offensive line is returning production, and the staff are returning, right? So Tedford originally announced that he was stepping down this offseason. Then he announces he's coming back. So you basically are just rerunning it from last year. This was an effective offense last year. Now they're just more familiar with each other, another year of development. You expect that they're going to at least be able to maintain the level that they had last year, if not build on that, right? And so, Malik Sherrod, people talk a lot about Genty in the Mountain West Conference, but, Sherrod to me is right up there. And by all indications from what I've heard and seen from the staff this offseason, their plan is to utilize him as much as possible this year. He'll be challenging Genty for a lead rusher in that conference, if I had to guess. And Fresno, similar to Boise, is a program in that conference that historically has always been fairly above average. And so they're another great shot, another good bet to win the Mountain West Conference this year for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned Sherrod, so I imagine you're targeting him as maybe one of the more like under discussed running backs in the nation, especially given some that they play in a Mountain West schedule that's relatively soft on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, well, on the CFF side, he's not so underrated or under discussed. I mean, there's people who will take him at the top of the second round currently in drafts. So, he's definitely a known commodity. And because there are explicit quotes this offseason that they're going to get their money's worth out of Sherrod, everybody sort of bought in on, okay, he's going to be a guy, probably 20 touches per game with Fresno. But there's all kinds of other players on that offense, right? Jalen Moss is another one who's a really popular pick a little bit later in CFF drafts, but he's the first wide receiver generally taken from Fresno in CFF drafts, and he's a guy who, if he wasn't 100 targets last year, I believe he was very close. But he should be a guy who's sniffing around that 100 target club this year. Probably, he could be in the slot. I'm not sure what the plan is with these two FCS receivers coming in now. They might be taking over in the slot. Jalen Moss, a guy who flexed in between both spots last year, played some in the slot, played some on the boundary. So he's a guy I'm really excited about. I would suspect he goes over 1,000 yards this season as well.
Awesome. Schedule, not a gimme for Fresno. They do travel to Michigan in week 1. That will very, very likely be a loss. They also play at UNLV. The Rebs get a bye before that one. They get out of a bye, though, in week 7. They host Washington State as a PAC-2 team, and then they close the year at UCLA. So let me make the quick case on why I like betting Fresno State to win the Mountain West. It's a little bit shorter than you'd probably like, with Boise State being such a favorite. But as I noted, I think that there's some questions with Boise. Worth noting, I see a pretty stark top 2. I think it's Boise and Fresno, and then a bit of a drop UNLV, and then everybody else. If we're in what I'm looking at in some of these schedules going into the season with the double bye, you look at Fresno State's close to the year. They get a bye in week 12, and then they play 2 games at home against Colorado State and at UCLA. And then the following week would be the Mountain West Championship game. So Fresno State should be pretty well rested if they were to make the conference championship game. On the other side, Boise State plays 6 straight games to close the year, which include a final 3. That is at San Jose State, at Wyoming, and then back home for Oregon State. Now, look, maybe Boise's already wrapped up the Mountain West. Maybe they're confident they could get the G5 bid. They rest their guys against Oregon State at home on Black Friday. Maybe it's possible, but I think you can maybe get a potential rest advantage for Fresno State in a potential matchup against Boise State that gives them a better number than the plus 360, plus 370 mark. And I'll shop that around before the end of the show. But that's why I like Fresno State as kind of my team I'm planting my flag on to win the Mountain West. Any thoughts there, Justin, on the perceived difference between these two teams?
No, I mean, I'm largely in agreement. I mean, I think, Fresno, you can argue sort of the schedules. It is difficult to project some of these other Mountain West Conference teams, how good they'll be. Wyoming, there's question marks. San Jose State, there's question marks. So, it is difficult, I think, sort of to judge the strength of the schedule later on. But certainly, I mean, I'm in agreement with most of what you said. I mean, I think both of those two teams at the top are kind of 1A, 1B. I'd still put Boise as my 1A, Fresno at 1B, but the margin between them in my mind is not very large.
Great. UNLV, this was my team last year, if you remember this season preview for those listeners. They have some turnover, though, despite a really strong year from late hire Barry Odom, the head coach, Brennan Marion running the go-go offense, really great first season as offensive coordinator, but they lose Jaden Mayava, who took over the role midseason and led them to the Mountain West Championship game. In comes Shulka from Holy Cross. He ran for over 1,200 yards. So it seems like he's a good fit here, Justin, with the likes of Ricky White, one of the best receivers in the country, and DeJesus. Do you see Shulka stepping in this UNLV offense being just as good and, being a Mountain West contender yet again? The expectation is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not going to take it as a given that Sluka is the starter this year because they brought in another quarterback too, in Haj Malik Williams, who comes over from Camp Bell. I think that's an FCS school or a Division II school. Similar kind of skill set. Wasn't quite as productive as Sluka at Holy Cross. But both of these quarterbacks, regardless of whoever wins, are dual threat guys. UNLV also brought in some transfer wide receivers. So they're going to have a few more options, I think, in the passing game. I do have question marks about how effective both of those passers will be. You mentioned Sluka's rushing ability. We know he's a good athlete and he can run. I do have question marks about how effective they will be in the air, but that's remains to be seen. UNLV is a team, they move fast on offense. You mentioned it, the go-go offense. They are sort of an exciting team. I think the questions with them again are going to be sort of how balanced are they? How effective is that running game? And the defensive side of the ball sort of let them down at times last year. So that'll be something to watch in terms of can they improve upon that, be a little bit more balanced and hang in with the Boise States of the conference. When those big games come around, is it just a track meet? Can they get stops?
This was a defense that fell off a cliff by the end of the season, especially in the secondary. And I will say, getting Barry Odom, he was a late hire in the process last year in his first season, a defensive-minded coach.
Yeah.
He definitely went out in the portal, though, and got some big names, including Jalen Catalon, who has experience from Arkansas and Texas. Manny Powell also comes from Arkansas. They get back their leading tackler in Woodard. So there's some blue chippers on the UNLV team. They really crushed the portal to try and patch this up. You look at the schedule, I'd say 5 likely wins, but there are a lot of coin flips on this schedule and a not so easy non-conference slate. While they're small underdog at Houston, it's still a Big 12 team. They play at Kansas on a short week. They also draw they draw the 2 best teams in Fresno and Boise State, but they're both at home. They also go at Oregon State and they host Syracuse in non-conference play. So it's a tricky schedule, lofty rating. UNLV, after loving them last year, more of a pass, kind of bearish on them, just given the jump in schedule and also maybe some just natural regression after a great season and maybe some holes in the roster. A team that has holes in the roster, Justin, Air Force, the lowest returning production in the entire country.
Yeah.
Only 5 true starters. I mean, they lose pretty much all quarterbacks of substance, but Busha, he saw time at the end of the season as injuries mounted at quarterback. They lose their top 2 rushers, 0 projected depth at offensive line. I mean, you look anywhere, there's pretty much all question marks. So, Justin, I'll lean to you here. Is this business as usual for Air Force where it's the system is too strong under Troy Calhoun to not rule them out? This is an Air Force team under Calhoun outside the pandemic season, because obviously this doesn't count, but they have won 7 or more games in 12 of 16 seasons under Calhoun. So is this plug and play, let's go, or are you like super concerned heading into the season?
Yeah, I'm more so concerned. I mean, and of course, I sort of speak more from a CFF perspective, but it sort of bleeds into the overall success of the team, right? I mean, I think it's something like 3% of the snaps on the offensive line they return year over year. So it's basically 0, basically an entirely new 5. That's concerning for a team in particular that relies on the ground game, right? All these service academies, they're very similar in that they have basically some derivation of a triple offense. And they lost both their top 2 runners from a year ago. The thing with Air Force, though, is it's a program that is built on sort of like it's all about the system. It's not about really the players, right? Like they don't ever have blue chip players. So I don't really I don't want to get focused too much on sort of individual skill players. I do sort of have some concern about the offensive line, how effective they're going to be sort of gelling in their first new season. But the 2 runners that are expected to sort of step up this year, Dylan Carson is expected to sort of fulfill in that fullback role. That is typically the most productive role in that offense. They also use a running back heavily. I think Aiden Calvert is the name that's supposed to step up in that role. So on the CFF side, people are drafting Dylan Carson, but it's very late. And part of the reason of that is there are large concerns about the offensive line, the effectiveness. The team as a whole, I'm pretty bearish on. I think I'm going to pass on most of their CFF players. I'd probably, if I wouldn't want to bet on them really. And if I had to, I would take the under on them. Because it's more so I just don't really know what to expect with them. There's lots of questions, and so there's really no certainty.
So the team has a win total of 6.5, 13-1 to win the conference. And while I think there's questions about the team, I think why is the win total still so high, in this conference, and why are they giving a shot? It's because the schedule sets up really nicely for them. They avoid UNLV and Boise State. So again, like that top three, they only play one. It's Fresno State, and it's at home. To be fair, though, they do play Army the week before, so a cross-country flight back, but they still do get the benefit of the doubt. Non-conference slate is Merrimack at Baylor, who they dump trucked in a bowl game, I think it was 2 years ago. And then you play Navy and Army, and you also draw Oregon State at home. In conference play, like I said, they missed two of the top three, and they also get the bottom two. Granted, it's on the road, but it's at New Mexico and at Nevada. So I can see why maybe some people can talk themselves into Air Force. Maybe, again, 12 of 16 seasons for Calhoun have gone over this, and it's not that daunting of a schedule. But it's a pass for me as well. I just, I got to see it before I really jump in. But this is a team that very quickly I can, I'm willing to, if I see it, I'm willing to completely turn around. I'm not fully writing them off. It's one where I just need to see it before I could just jump right in before the season.
Yeah, no, I'm on the same page there.
So I imagine this team, Colorado State, has a lot of CFF excitement. Win total 6.5. They are 15-1 to win the conference. You're going to see a real glut of teams with this 6.5 win total now. This is year 3 for Jay Norvell. Braden Fowler, Nicolosi, big arm, makes some mistakes, but he's a high risk, high reward type player. Torrey Horton, they managed to wrangle him back in. They do lose Justice Ross Simmons, but the transfer from Cincinnati, Ali, 6'3" target, comes in. Offensive line was elite last season in pass pro. A lot of that has to do with the quick twitch nature of this offense, but all 5 starters are back. The running back, Justin Marshall, he only played 3 games, but really shined at the end of the season. So I think this offense is set to go and can rival the top of the conference. So, Justin, before we talk about the defense, offense, CFF, all thoughts, Rams, are you in on this team?
Yeah, well, you really hit the nail on the head there, covering the personnel. And for those who watched the Mountain West Conference or are familiar with it, you'll remember that Jay Norvell used to be at Nevada. He was there for several years, and when he was there, he really built that program up into one of the best in the conference. And they had a great offense with all kinds of different players there. Similar setup to what he has here at Colorado State. They always had a good tight end, Cole Turner, for those who maybe remember that name. And Romeo Doubs was another wide receiver that was a star for him at Nevada. It's a very similar setup here now at Colorado State, right? He has that big receiver, Torrey Horton. He's going to have a big year by all indications. He's a first-round pick in every CFF draft that I've seen. Braden Fowler, Nicolosi, he was a freshman last year, right? He was a young player. So the fact that he even played and actually showed himself pretty well is really a bonus. Most players are not supposed to be playing as freshmen. So the fact that he played and now he's returning as a starter is a big plus in my mind. Passing attack should take a step forward. They do lose Lewis Brown to San Diego State and JRS, as you mentioned, to Syracuse. But they do return Dylan Goffney as well. He's a guy who they brought in from SMU, I think, last offseason. He'll offload some of those slot targets. Dallin Holker, replacing him is the big question mark that I have. And I think a lot of the people in the CFF space are really honing in on, because that was a very productive tight end. He was a top 2 tight end in CFF last year. They bring in a kid. His name is Jalen Warren, or Jackson Warren, I think, from he's a freshman, actually. Originally committed to Ball State, flipped his commitment late to Colorado State. Very similar build to Dallin Holker. He's a guy that people in the CFF space, at least, are honing in on as the guy to target at tight end in that offense. And then at running back, they basically return everybody except for, I think, Van Shield is the only one who left. He wasn't that involved last year. So you mentioned Justin Marshall. He played in 3 games, was very productive in those 3 games, and got injured. Kobe Johnson, though, was another one, right? They brought him in as a transfer from North Dakota State, I believe it was, a year ago. He was productive in the FCS. Shined at times last year, but I think he was still transitioning to that level of play. So we'll see what happens. So they've got a lot of options on offense. I think the offense is loaded. I do want to see what happens at tight end, but I think that offense should be very productive in year 3 of Norvell's regime.
Yeah, and the defense was also very productive. Now they do lose their prized pass rusher in Kamara. He had 14 sacks last season. So it's fair to assume maybe the defensive line takes a step back. I mean, they were top 20 in tackles for loss, but overall top 50 in returning production. So pretty there's depth here that can maybe make up for a loss of like a really solid pass rusher in Kamara. The secondary has 3 starters back. Again, this team was nationally average in terms of EPA per play. Adjusted for strength of schedule, this team maybe is below average nationally, but still, I think there's a reason to be bullish about this Colorado State team. So let's just go through the schedule real quick because it is interesting. They're going to lose at Texas in week 1. They get Northern Colorado, and then they host the Buffs, Big Brother Buffs, and we all remember last year's game. I mean, that's going to be a night game. I'm almost certain it's on CBS prime time. We'll see how Colorado starts the season, but that game is circled for me as a play on Colorado State based on how last year's game went, how this team is trending, and how I'm kind of mildly concerned about Colorado heading into the season. They also play UTEP at home before a bye. I mean, they avoid Boise State, UNLV, and Fresno State on the schedule. So they avoid all 3. So I think there's a really solid run. I mean, look, there's still some toss-ups here. They have to go to Air Force. I'm sorry, I misspoke. They go to Fresno State at the end of the year. So avoid 2 of the 3. They go to Air Force, but they draw New Mexico and at Nevada on the schedule. They host potential coin flip games against Wyoming and Utah State. I think there's a lot to like with the Rams this season. So, Justin, out of like this mid-tier, and we're going to talk about a few more, but do you think Colorado State is like the highest upside to maybe jump up and contend for the Mountain West given, or have we not spoken about that team yet?
No. I think Colorado State really is that team that can sort of jump and have that UNLV kind of, not quite to the same degree, they weren't that bad, but have that sort of big jump year over year. I mean, again, I mentioned Norvell. He's done this before, right? He took over a poor performing program in the Mountain West, built them into one of the best programs when he left in Nevada. So he knows what the blueprint is. He's building it basically in the exact same format. He's got all these 6'3" tall wide receivers on offense. He's doing the exact same thing that he did at Nevada. I expect year 3 or this year should be an improvement and a jump, not just because Norvell's been there, but also because the quarterback's returning. And you mentioned that game versus Colorado. They really should have won that game last
100% should have won.
Yeah, so like you got to imagine that's been annoying them for 365 or will be for a year leading up to that game. There's all the antics of him back and forth with Dion. So they'll be revved up for that one. They should have won last year, and I think, they could very easily win it this year. And as you mentioned, they avoid 2 of the 3 of those sort of big dogs in the conference. So the schedule sets up nicely. It's a team that really could see a nice bump, I think.
So Wyoming has been like the perpetual upper middle team in the Mountain West, a team that is constantly, good as an underdog, maybe struggle when they're a favorite. They lose Craig Bowl, but it looks like they're going to try and keep the same identity. They promoted their defensive coordinator, Saywell. I believe it's Bull's son taking over as OC or is on the staff still. So I think that this is still going to be Bull ball. He's just not necessarily on the sidelines. They do lose Andrew Peasley, who ended up turning into a pretty solid quarterback. I'm going to say his name wrong because I suck at all these, but Sabata, I think I got it right. More of a run first, huge run first type of quarterback with Harrison Whaley, who when healthy was really, really solid, well over 5 yards a pop last year. 4 of the 5 back on the offensive line, and a defense that's always been don't break, top 40 in returning production, 34th in yards per play last season. Is this business as usual for Wyoming? Going to play slow, run the ball, play field position, lean on their defense to keep them in games and, hope to win tight? Or do you see maybe a change for the better or worse here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think largely, I mean, that's another program or organization that's almost kind of like Wisconsin, some of these other ones where they have an identity and they generally do try to stick to it. But I do think there's going to be a bit of a change on offense. So the new OC, Jay Johnson, he was the OC at Michigan State when Kenneth Walker won his Doak Walker Award. He had a fantastic year as a running back, as an individual running back. I think they gave him like 300 carries. A lot of the people in the CFF space are sort of holding their breath on Harrison Whaley, that maybe he'll be Johnson's next sort of Kenneth Walker commodity this year. But in reading the quotes from Johnson, he mentioned, and he specifically references that Michigan State team and why it was successful was because it was very balanced. And he said, we could throw for 300 or we could, run for 150 every game. And that kept sort of teams off balance. So I think that there will be quite an emphasis on trying to establish the passing game utilizing the run to open up the pass, of course, but trying to balance the two. The DC, or formerly the DC, is now the head coach, as you mentioned, Sawvell. I would expect that the defense continues to be quite stingy, given that the guy who ran the defense last year is still in charge, and they're always pretty solid on defense. So I would expect that they're still largely a ground and pound team on offense, with relying on defense, moving sort of slow. They've got 4 of the 5 returners on offense on the offensive line, as you mentioned. So that is going to be a strength of the team. But I do think the passing attack might be a little bit more. It's going to be a little more balanced this year in terms of their run pass split, I think.
Yeah, I'm interested to see Evan Sabata, who is all indications are he's going to take over as quarterback. He saw time last season, especially Peasley was a little banged up, especially against Texas. 41 dropbacks last season, 1 big time throw to 3 turnover worthy plays. Again, maybe the offense kind of develops a little bit more, but worth noting, he also had 25 runs. So he definitely was seen as more of a run first quarterback. We'll see if maybe he could show off some arm strength. Schedule is interesting for the Pokes. They go to Arizona State in week 1. They're about a 7-point underdog. Then they get Idaho, BYU at home before they go to North Texas to end their non-con slate. So it's a pretty interesting one at that. In Mountain West play, they host Boise State. They go to Colorado State. Both teams off a bye there. So it's an interesting slate. I mean, a lot of coin flip games. They host Air Force. They host San Diego State. They host Utah State. They go to San Jose State. So it's an interesting setup here for Wyoming in year 1 of the Savell era. TBD on how it looks. But we'll see if maybe the offense shows to be a little bit more balanced than it's been in the past, but you could expect a lot of tight games.
Yeah, well, and as far as schedules go, if you're looking at G5 schedules, that out of conference schedule is about as good as you can ask for. I mean, they're only 7-point underdogs against their probably toughest opponent, Arizona State, right? So, I mean, usually G5 teams, you can pencil in 2 losses, maybe 3 on that out of conference schedule. With Wyoming, honestly, every game is a coin flip. They could win all 3 of those games. Probably not going to, but feasibly, you could reason that out.
Yeah, 100%. It seems like a team that, again, bowl, no pun intended, but bowl, like very, very likely, like 6 wins, pretty sharp on that. But maybe 7 wins is where you start to see, we'll see if they actually could get there. That might be where they run into some struggles. Mm-hmm. Team that is going under some real big changes is San Diego State. They hire Sean Lewis away after he is, demoted and leaves Colorado after a year. This is, again, the architect of the flash fast offense at Kent State a few years ago. A really successful offense. We'll see if it could hit so fast. I'm cautiously optimistic. Again, the San Diego State offense became among the worst in the country last year. There is some talent at quarterback. AJ Duffy transfers from Florida State. Danny O'Neill may contend for the job. He's a freshman. We'll see who gets the first crack at it. Lewis brought in Marquez Cooper from that flash fast offense. He was at Ball State last year, ran for 1,000 yards. So there's some cause for optimism that someone like that, Cooper, could really take over. Also, Keenan Christian from USC. So some pedigree coming in there. We'll see. Offensive line, 3 new starters, but they're running a whole new scheme. So I think there are going to be question marks anyway. I don't think that's one where I don't know if it will matter as much as like an Air Force we were talking about before, because everyone's learning anyway. The defense is probably going to struggle, though. Need to replace 9 of 11 starters. A lot of FCS transfers. They hired Eric Schmidt to run the defense. He is the former Washington defensive line coach, so I expect a aggressive front where they're going to try and blitz. This is a team that was a dead under team last year. I imagine it will be a dead over team this year. Justin, thoughts on the Aztecs in year 1 of the I don't even know what they're calling it. Flash fast. I don't know if there's a nickname in the CFF community for this one.
Well, yeah. Well, so thoughts on Lewis and SDSU. So there is sort of a wisdom forming within the CFF community that whenever there are these large scale regime changes with lots of transfers, it's usually the second year where you see that big bump in terms of production and huge spike in value in terms of their individual players, right? And that sort of bleeds into the actual team success as well. And you mentioned, and I think you did a good overlay there in terms of the relevant names, right? So Lewis coming over from Colorado, sort of reshaping the offense from scratch, right? San Diego State last year was sort of a lame duck program. They had a head coach. He was at the tail end of his career. He's just I think he checked out towards the end, and team success suffered. But with Lewis now coming in, he was a successful head coach at Kent State. His offenses, and you mentioned it, they were quite productive there. We were all holding our breath on the CFF side that when Marcus Cooper had hit the portal, that he'd end up with Lewis at San Diego State. But he's not the only good running back over there. You mentioned one of the other names, Keenan Christian. He originally began his career at USC, and as a freshman had a couple of really big games. I remember this because this was back when Yahoo still had fantasy. I actually rostered him for a couple of weeks as a freshman. This is back in 2019, I think. He's a guy who broke, I don't know if he broke records, but he was a high pedigree sort of track guy in high school, really fast player, home run hitter. And then he brings Lewis Brown from Colorado State, who he would have been familiar with coaching at Colorado. He would have seen him in that game when they played the Buffs. And then another player he brought in is Jay-Sean Polk, who was originally with Kent State back in 2020. So that's another player that Lewis is familiar with, another guy who could sort of have a resurgent sort of year here in 2024. But overall, I think this first year, as you typically see with large-scale regime changes, is this first year is going to be a lot of growing pains. I don't know how effective the offense really is going to be. I suspect they're going to try to establish the run with Cooper and try to get him. I mean, he was a 1,000-yard runner under Lewis for 3 straight seasons at Kent State. So I imagine they're going to try to, give him a lot of carries at San Diego State. But I don't know how effective that offense is going to be. I'm fairly skeptical. I'd probably be a little more excited with the passing assets because they're probably going to be playing from behind a lot, even in that Mountain West Conference. I suspect they're probably going to have a tough time this year.
Yeah, win total of 5.5. So if Lewis could get this team to a bowl, job well done. Maybe it's year 2. And I think it's interesting because I imagine maybe I'm not giving enough credit to sharper people in the space, both betting and CFF. But if they kind of fall flat on their face in year 1, it almost gives inherent value. It's almost like people are oh, we're buying in year 1, and then a little bit of a drop off. It's we're not running that back. That was kind of a mistake. So it almost if you a little bit of holding power, or if you time it right, you can maybe actually jump in at the correct moment. I think this offense is going to be fine given what's in the Mountain West. I don't know if it's going to be high level, but it will be enough to put up points, I think. I don't think this will be a nightmare unit like it was last year, of course. And I think the defense is where they're really going to struggle. Like I mentioned, replacing 9 of 11 starters, starting from scratch. We'll see. It's probably just a year 0 here, more likely. Look at the schedule. Outside of some of the where they play the stalwarts of the conference, like at Boise State on a short week, at UNLV, they host Washington State, but they play Texas A&M Commerce, they host Oregon State, and at Cal. So there's an opportunity where the offense, Oregon State and Cal for higher rated teams. I wouldn't say those massive defenses. And then they come out of a bye, play at Central Michigan, Hawaii. So maybe this team could get out to a hotter start, especially on the offense side of the ball, before maybe they see some setback at the end of the year. They close with 6 straight games, 3 of them on the road. No real touch for me. It would be a lean on the under for the Aztecs, but nothing really here for me just because of you don't really know where this team is going so quickly. Utah State, I'm happy I kind of held on to doing the preview because in the last 2 weeks, they fired their head coach, Blake Anderson, who was also running the offense this year. There was a lot of rumors around what was up with Utah State. We don't need to get into that, but we'll see if this holds up. But with a lot of transfers coming in, Anderson named Spencer Petras, the Iowa transfer, the starting quarterback in the spring. That's over the likes of Braxton Barnes, who showed out at Utah in some backup snaps last year, and CJ Tiller from Boise State. So I think that's pretty interesting. Jalen Royals, I imagine, is the one CFF guy to talk about. He had 1,000 yards last season, and Robert Biggs is going to be the RB1. But I think more than anything, with Anderson being fired, are you just really out on this Utah State team? You think this could be a real snowball effect? Or is it almost Northwestern where they kind of rally? It's not that bad. Anderson was kind of a bad cloud over the team and they could rally. I'm not sure the vibes here, but the schedule doesn't do any favors. And I was down on this team to begin with going into the year. And now you throw in this coaching change. So how do you view this
Well,
year.
it certainly doesn't help, right? It's always sort of about continuity and uncertainty. The more uncertainty there is with something, the more you kind of want to step away from it. In terms of my CFF perspective, though, on offense in particular, the guy who's taking over as the OC is a Blake Anderson disciple. He's been with Anderson for his entire tenure at Utah State and was with him at Arkansas State. So he understands the system. He's going to run the same system on offense. The question marks that I had on offense now are the same as before. I don't know that Spencer Petras can really unlock the full potential of the offense. He's been sort of described as a good game manager, so hopefully he's not going to be turning the ball over a lot. But I'm not really sure he's the guy to sort of unlock, the full sort of gambit of what the offense can do. So Jalen Royals, of course, is a receiver. He returns coming off a 1,000-yard season. But they had two really good receivers last year. So Terrell Vaughn in the slot was actually their primary guy for most of the season. Then Royals kind of ascended later in the year. So the thought in the CFF side was that, okay, well, we know Royals and he's on the outside. But lately, it's really been that slot receiver in Blake Anderson's system that's been sort of their main guy. So Devin Tompkins is another name that some people may recognize. He was, second leader in receiving in the entire FBS a couple of years ago. So there's been a lot of sort of questions and discussion about who's going to take over that slot role at Utah State. So there's another guy. He comes from JUCO. His name is Robert Freeman. And it's from this perspective, it's unfortunate that Anderson's moving on because Anderson spoke about Freeman very glowingly. I mean, he compared him to Devin Tompkins, compared him to Terrell Vaughn. It doesn't get much better than that on the CFF side in terms of comparisons because both of those guys were extremely, extremely productive receivers. But I imagine that this new OC, who is a disciple of Anderson, is going to basically keep it running as sort of it would have with Anderson. We don't know how effective he'll be as a play caller, but in terms of the system and the tendencies of the offense and what they're going to look like on offense, I'd imagine it's going to be quite similar. I didn't like them as one of the best teams in the conference before. Didn't think they were one of the worst. Anderson's departure doesn't really change my view too much on that standpoint. It introduces some uncertainty, but on the offense, at least in particular, I pretty much it's the same for me.
Okay. And I think if you discuss this team as a whole, Utah State, went to a bowl last year, but I would say kind of overachieved given what was there. They had some injuries. They were rotating quarterbacks. This is a team, though, I'm just looking to fade. You look at the schedule, the non-con. They host Robert Morris, and then they go at USC, Utah, and they travel cross country to play Temple. Temple sucks, but I think that's at best a coin flip game. I don't think you could confidently say Utah State should be favored there. The conference schedule is pretty brutal. They come out of a bye and they play at Boise State, then back home on a short week to play UNLV at home. While they draw New Mexico, that's pretty much it from like the dregs of the conference. They play at Wyoming, at Colorado State, at Washington State. I know that's PAC-2, but that's still on the schedule. I think this could be a tough year for Utah State, I think, especially when you look at the defense and where it was last season. This team was really allowed 30 points in 8 games last season. New DC Nate Drelling will try to fix that, but I think this could be a down year for Utah State as they look to figure out their team. A team I'm higher on, Hawaii. It's year 3 of Timmy Chang. They're top 10 in returning production. Most of that comes on the offense side of the ball. Braden Schrager, I think, has acquitted himself nicely and is a pretty capable runner as well. Ashlock and McBride at wide receiver, both threats for 1,000 yards. There's returning production on the offensive line as well. New defensive coordinator Dennis Thurman comes from the NFL ranks. They returned 9 of 11 starters. They were pretty bad, but continuity. At least they all know each other, so that helps. The issue, while I like this team, I think that there may be a play-on team in terms of like really shooting high. The Mountain West schedule is pretty tough. Win total 4.5. They play at Fresno and UNLV, or they play at Fresno and UNLV and Boise are both on the schedule. They play Nevada and New Mexico at home, so those 2 should be wins, you would think. And they play 2 FCS teams, so that's 4. It's where does the 5th win come from to get over this win total, or do they drop one? They also play at Sam Houston State. So, Justin, are you in on this Hawaii team heading into year 3 of the Chang era?
Yeah. So again, is one of the points I mentioned earlier in terms of the CFF sort of side of it is when you're looking at these regime changes, it's usually that second year where you see that big pop. And so, Timmy Chang came in there last offseason. There's a lot of turnover, a lot of new names, and we had a lot of questions. Nobody sort of knew what receivers, what quarterback, who were going to be the starters, who were going to be the main guys on offense. This year, we have basically full certainty. Outside of really quarterback, Shager returns, but he wasn't that great last year, and he might not keep his job. But the two receivers, everybody knows now as well.
Interesting you think that. I thought he had some. I thought he was pretty decent last year for all things considered.
Well, maybe all things considered is the fair way to say it, because overall, team wasn't great, and so the quarterback play is going to suffer, and both of those things influence each other. I don't know. I thought he was a little bit careless with the football, and that run and shoot offense, is fairly forgiving, or should be fairly QB friendly. So, but we'll see. I mean, that was his first year. Again, regime change, learning the offense. It is what it is. This year, they've got quite a bit of returning on the team, as you mentioned. My question really, as I mentioned, is sort of the quarterback play, how effective they'll be. But that system, that run and shoot system, historically has been extremely productive in college football. I'm expecting both those wide receivers to be hitting around 1,000 yards. That could be a function of the fact that they're playing from behind a lot, though, too, this year. But yeah, I like Hawaii. Hawaii could sneak up on some teams. They have that sort of benefit of when teams have to come and play them. It's such a brutal travel stretch, but it's a double-edged sword, right? Because then they're also it's really rough for them when they have to go onto the mainland. So that's something to consider as well. And I think you said their out-of-conference schedule includes Sam Houston. Who else?
So their out-of-conference schedule is Delaware State,
Yeah,
UCLA. And then, so they play Delaware State in week 0, so they get like the extra bye game. So Delaware State, UCLA bye, at Sam Houston, Northern Iowa bye, and then they play 2, 4, 6, 7 in a row before they get a bye to play New Mexico at home to end the season. So it's a weird schedule, and with the week 0 gets even weirder. But it's a team that I think is on the rise. I think they just have to be.
Yeah, and Hawaii always has a weird schedule because they always play that week 0 game.
Yep.
But again, that out-of-conference schedule, actually, when you sort of think of G5 out-of-conference schedules, really isn't that bad, right? Sam Houston just got elevated to the FBS last year.
Yes.
They were an FCS team. UCLA, you think of that, and that's a P5 team. They're in the Big Ten. You think, okay, that's a big game or big team that they have to play. But UCLA, there's a lot of question marks. They could be one of the worst teams in the FBS this year. Nobody really knows anything about them. They don't.
Keep an eye on that one. Hawaii, that game could get weird. That's UCLA first game, whole new staff. That is not a game you want on the schedule.
Yeah, and so I'm not going to call the upset, but it's one where that could be a very interesting game early in the season where Hawaii just catches one of those P5 teams, or P4, I guess I should say, catches them out and gives us an exciting game at the very least, maybe pulls off the upset. So that out-of-conference schedule actually isn't that bad. It's the Mountain West Conference schedule, unfortunately, sort of levels it out where, okay, that's tough. But if they can steal a couple in the Mountain West Conference, I mean, watch out. I mean, they could sort of elevate past their win total.
Yeah, it also something just with the schedule. Again, this is like one of the funkiest in the country. That stretch of 7 straight games, they are going to and from Hawaii each week. So there's no like advantageous setup. It's getting perpetually worse and worse as they go with all the traveling. So Hawaii might get off to a hot start, and then it really peters off as the year goes on. So the last 3 teams, I want to just do the PAC-2 really quick before we get out of here. So to me, San Jose State, Nevada, New Mexico, like I put San Jose State closer to like the bottom, given a lot of the questions on the team. Maybe you could talk me out of it. I'm willing to be turned on that. And then I think Nevada and New Mexico, unfortunately, are just like really at the bottom. So really quick on San Jose State, Ken Niumatalolo takes over. They're running the quote spread and shred offense. Craig Stutzman comes from Texas State to run the offense. Obviously, that Texas State was a really high-powered offense. They bring back Nick Nash and Lockhart, who had injuries last year. Quarterback is where there's a lot of questions. Justin, do you have any thoughts on either Emmett Brown or from Washington State, or Walker Eget, the freshman? I just think there's too many questions to really get excited about this team. This feels like year 0. I don't see a hot start coming. So any thoughts on maybe the offense taking a jump under a new quarterback or a new coaching staff?
Yeah, well, so you asked me about the QBs. Yeah, I don't really have a strong thought on either of them because it's not determined. I don't even think at this moment who is going to be the starter. Which generally, when the QB battle goes this far into the offseason, that generally says like, okay, one, they don't really have a guy. It's just going to be they're going to have a mediocre QB probably this year. Uh, I'm glad you pronounced the head coach's last name because I'm not going to attempt to. Coach N, I'm going to call him. He comes over and he spent several years, I believe it was Navy. So he's
Yes.
running that triple option offense at Navy. They're not going to run the triple option offense at San Jose State. You mentioned the OC, Craig Stutzman, comes over from Texas State, was formerly at Utah Tech. Ironically, when he was at Utah Tech, had Quayle Conley, who was running back at San Jose State last year, transferred to Arizona, a small world. But so they're going to run some derivation of that spread and shed offense. So it should look kind of similar to what you saw at Texas State last year, with some elements of, I think, that triple option, or at least the run heavy tendency that Coach N likes. So there might, from a CFF perspective at the very least, there might be some value in that running back room. They brought in a kid. His name is Floyd Chalk. Played in Louisiana last year at the FCS level, I believe at Grambling State. Was in sort of a split backfield of another runner, but he accumulated like 600, 700 rushing yards, was fairly efficient with his touches. I don't remember his yards per carry off the top, but I think it was around 5. So he's a guy who could be, a very sneaky, surprising, at least CFF asset this year, where they might be running the ball a lot. And he could be a guy who gets a lot of volume coming his way. The sort of strange thing about the offense is their actual best returning players, probably those 2 wide receivers you mentioned. Yeah. So I imagine they're going to try to utilize them. I mean, at Texas State last year, they had Joey Hobart, who Stutzman utilized quite a bit. They also had Ashton Hawkins, who's now at Baylor. Both of those guys were pretty productive for them. So we could see something similar there. But, Texas State had probably better quarterback play last year than San Jose State's going to have this year. I don't want to say that definitively. I don't know that much about these QBs. But year 0 again, and I guess I'm going to keep repeating this mantra from a CFF perspective. That first year, you kind of want to be trepidatious. It's going to be a transition year. We don't really know what to expect. Year 2 is where you could really see probably a bump on the offense. So San Jose State, from an offense perspective, some interesting features there, but not an offense I'm super excited about.
Yeah, I have San Jose State favored in 3 games, win total of 4.5. Those games are Sacramento State, Kennesaw State at home, and Nevada at home. The rest of the schedule, I see them all as underdogs. I just think it's a tough schedule. It's a team that's tough to project. I would do under, if anything, just given the state of the team. The offensive line's full of questions, and the defense also has plenty of questions as well.
Yeah.
So I think this could be a tough year for the Spartans, who actually finished last year pretty well. And hey, head coach Brett Brennan got a P4 job. I do the same thing as you. I keep saying P5. It's a P4 now.
It's going to take a while to, yeah.
Yeah. So Nevada, New Mexico. I have notes on these teams. I'd rather talk about Oregon State and Washington State. So just really quick to go over them. Each team has a win total of 2.5. Nevada returns only 6 starters back on their defense. The offense does have returning production with a new coach. Brandon Lewis is still there. He's terrible. Chuba Purdy transferred in. We'll see. The running back room should be pretty decent. Pat Garwo transfers from BC, but Sean Dollars, their leading rusher last year, he got hurt in the spring game.
Yeah.
I haven't seen like an update. Obviously, fall camp starts in a few weeks, so we'll get some clarity there. They lose their top 2 receivers. They're favored in 1 game against Eastern Washington. I don't have much to say here. Do you have anything of note? Nevada, just probably just a terrible team. I really don't have.
I think they'll be the worst team in the conference this year. It's going to be a tough year for them. And Garro is an interesting asset from a CFF perspective. Maybe he's the guy who just gets leaned on. Sean Dollars had a horrific injury in the spring game. And as you said, no update. I don't know if he's going to be back this year. So it might just be a case where they just concentrate all the volume to Garro. He's an interesting name. But yeah, terrible team. Probably the worst in the conference.
I'm glad we agree, though. So I think Nevada's going to be the worst. New Mexico was the one who was New Mexico has like the hardest schedule in the country. So I think that's like why they're projected to be the worst record-wise. But I think New Mexico is going to be a better team. Like they're more likely to win games, in my opinion, than Nevada. They bring in Bronco Mendo home. Obviously, BYU, Virginia. Jason Beck's running the offense. I also like Dan Pierre, their quarterback, who got some run at the end of the year. But listen, I mean, they lose probably their best offensive player in Korsky Merritt, who went to Arizona. He's filthy. Keep an eye on him. They return no offensive linemen. and their defense only had 8 sacks last year. So listen, the team's going to be very bad. I just think that I give more faith to this team rather than Nevada. But they'll be an underdog in every single game this season. So anything else to say about New Mexico?
Yeah, well, no, I love the staff, or I like the staff a lot more at New Mexico than I do Nevada. So
Yeah.
you mentioned these guys, Bronco Mendenhall and Jason Beck. Everywhere they've been, they've had good offenses, especially at their last stop. So that Virginia offense, they were pulling out miracles with Brennan Armstrong, who I don't know how many people will recognize that name, but he lit the world on fire in 2021. He had a massive season, and that whole offense really, they had multiple receivers killing it, running backs, tight ends. And you mentioned the name. He's the one that everybody's excited about on the CFF side, Devin Dampier. Young quarterback, has a dual threat skill set. I don't know that if this is going to be the year where he really breaks through, but if he stays there and the staff stays there for the next couple seasons, I think he's going to have a year where he really breaks out, sort of within the national scene. I think he's going to have some video game numbers there at some point in his career, because that is a great system for quarterback play. He has an interesting skill set. That's a team where they're going to have their pedal to the floor basically every game. They're going to be playing from behind a lot. So again, I don't know that this is the year really where you see that big pop from Dampier, but I think probably in the future, near future, that could be an offense that really sneaks up on people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and definitely like an over team, I would say, because I don't see the defense stopping away, but I think the offense can do some stuff. I don't know if it's like I think the offense is going to be capable enough to make this work. I want to do the PAC-2 because I think it's just a natural fit to squeeze them in. And Justin said it was all good if we could hit on them real quick. And I think obviously all this stuff happens with the conference as a whole and stuff, but I think that these two teams are in an interesting spot, like team composition wise. Oregon State, obviously, they lose so much from last year's dream season. Jonathan Smith goes, their recruit Aiden Childs goes. They lose their top 3 receivers, 4 or 5 on the offensive line. They lose like everybody basically. Washington State, not gutted as much, but they lose their like singular talent in Cam Ward, who really propped up a lot of what they wanted to do under offensive coordinator Ben Arbuckle and head coach Dickert. So I think it's interesting that these two teams now are like in this nomad state and also like go through like a huge transition. So let's start with Oregon State. Win total 7.5. I think this is just a total guess. Obviously, the schedule is pretty favorable relative to other years, but I don't know how you could confidently say this Oregon State team is going 8-4. Like I mentioned, I mean, this team is like bottom of the barrel in terms of returning production everywhere. I hope for their sake, the Idaho transfer is the one that takes over at quarterback because he might be more electric.
Giovanni McCoy.
Yeah, McCoy. But listen, they have a veteran in Bill Branson, who I imagine will get plenty of opportunity to win the job. But how do you view this Oregon State team? Because again, like to me, like win total 7.5, I think that's baked in a lot of last year and not what this team actually is.
Yeah, well, it's a sad thing to look at. Oregon State is this program that for a while was sort of a doormat and then was built up miraculously really into like a top 15 program the last couple of seasons. Like, I mean, Jonathan Smith and that staff did a fantastic job. And really Oregon State and Washington State are two of my sort of favorite teams that I watch from a distance. There's just something sort of lovable about both of those programs. But Oregon State, you mentioned, was just absolutely gutted this year. I mean, the tailback to Miami, quarterback to Michigan State, tight end to Michigan State, offensive line not returning much. The one positive thing is their schedule is probably easier than it was in the PAC. I mean, like their conference opponents should be easier versus just on a talent perspective, right? I mean, Oregon State's been recruiting at a P4 level for several years now. A lot of those players obviously left, but the guys who were behind were probably of a higher caliber than a lot of these G5 guys. So there is that. Giovanni McCoy, Idaho State transfer, was he got some accolades last year. It might have been freshman of the year or something like that. I was listening to a beat writer or beat reporter the other day about Oregon State, and he said pretty confidently McCoy is the starter, or is going to be the starter.
As he should be. Like, you might as well take the swing.
Might as well take the swing, and I always feel better when there's a quarterback who wins the job sort of definitively earlier. The earlier it happens, the better in my opinion, because that sort of indicates, okay, they have a guy, rather than it being dragged out. That sort of suggests whoever wins it's probably not really that good. But Oregon State, interesting team this year, obviously. I mean, there's lots of question marks. At running back, I think, they've got a couple of guys there. Hankerson, or I think transferred from Colorado. Jam Griffin, who was there before too. That backfield was sort of one that CFF players highlighted in the past because Jonathan Smith really had a nice sort of track record there of funneling a lot of carries to his RB1. I have no idea what the plan is this year. So the new OC was the DC last year, or the new head coach was the DC last year. New OC is UCLA's former quarterback coach, and his sort of claim to fame is developing Dorian Thompson-Robinson. Chip Kelly was there as well. He probably had a hand in that. So who knows how much influence he really had there. But Dorian Thompson-Robinson, a player where similar skill set to Giovanni McCoy. So if you're looking at that quarterback room and what to sort of expect, maybe that's a plus. Wide receivers and tight ends, I have absolutely no idea. It's one of those programs where the unit I actually don't know. I don't think anybody knows really at this point. And so, that's a program. It's very hard to make of what because they've got a lot of conflicting forces. Schedule is easier, but players are all gone. I have really no idea what to say. I can't say anything definitively other than I think there's going to be new names that step up for them on offense.
Yeah, I would say like this has to be an under, but the schedule it's just not as difficult while they play the likes of Oregon, Purdue, Washington State, and at Boise State. They also play at Nevada. They host Purdue. They play Idaho State. They host San Jose State. I think that there's room for this team to get over. I would play under or nothing, but I just think there's so many questions. Only 2 sacks back on the defensive line, and they lose 9 starters that played 200 or more snaps. So, and the team is just absolutely gutted. But look, like you said, they've been recruiting well. I think McCoy gives them some upside that may not to me, if like Gulbranson was like the clear cut starter, I'd be like, okay, this team is probably going to suck because Gulbranson in reality is just like sucks. So I think McCoy gives them some interesting upside that I think could be exciting. So we'll see how the Beavers do in this new PAC-2 era. I would say, though, I'm higher on Washington State as a whole heading into the season. While like I mentioned, they lose Cam Ward. They do have some interesting transfers coming in. They do have Kyle Williams coming back at receiver. He had 842 yards receiving. Trey Shackelford comes in from Austin P. Any thoughts, though, on the quarterback? Is it going to be Eckhouse from Bryant that takes over? He passed for 3,000 yards. I think he could be a seamless fit into this Ben Arbuckle offense. Any thoughts on Wazoo's offense?
Yeah, well, they're still in the quarterback competition. So Zevi Eckhouse and John Mateer is the other one. So, and this, of course, this offense, for those who don't know, this is an air raid offense. And this head coach and offensive coordinator, I should say, is a disciple of Zach Kitley, who was the offensive coordinator at Western Kentucky. For those who don't know, when he was there in 2021, his quarterback, Bailey Zappi, actually holds the record currently for the most passing touchdowns in college football. It broke Joe Burrow's 2019 record. So this is an offense that is known for high volume passing. Okay, and the quarterback, whoever wins it, is expected to be a guy who can complete passes at a high clip. The fact that the quarterback competition is ongoing still worries me a little bit in terms of circling one guy who's clearly good. But I have confidence in the staff and in the system that whoever they put into the offense should be able to run it and execute it at a high level, because the offense is sort of based on a lot of quick passes. And on that note, I should say that if you're looking at wide receivers, you mentioned one, Kyle Williams. He's their most productive returning receiver. But this system, historically, it's the slot receiver who is the primary guy. So Jarrett Stearns is a player who played at Western Kentucky. He's the last college football wide receiver to lead the sport in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns in the same season. He had 150 receptions in 2021. That's not a number you see very often. And last year, it was Lincoln Victor, who was the slot player for Washington State, and he was putting up video game numbers before he got injured. So there's a lot of questions on the CFF side, who's going to get the starting slot receiver role. 2 names that have emerged in spring, Josh Meredith and Chris Hudson. Those are the 2 guys who are vying for that starting slot role. And there's even some discussion that they might just have 2 slot players a lot of the time in terms of their alignment, or 2 slot players on the field in various different roles. So that offense I'm a little more confident in because, one, the staff stay the same. System that has a long track record of very, very strong production at multiple different positions. And they weren't gutted quite as much, right? I mean, a lot of people make a big deal about Cam Ward. Cam Ward was good, He wasn't very good his first year, and then he took a big jump last year. But the quarterbacks, it remains to be seen. Of course, right? There's still a question mark there, but I'm a little more confident with Washington State. They're not as gutted, and the staff remains the same, and we know sort of what to make of this system.
Yeah, the defense. First, I think Jake Dickert's a great coach. They are 112th in returning production on defense. They lose their top two pass rushers that combined for 15 sacks. So this was a defense that was 60th in EPA per play last year. I think, though, given the schedule adjustment, maybe they could hold on to a national average. We'll see, just given, again, continuity on the staff. Washington State, look, they went 5-7 last year. They really struggled in Pac-12 play. But, the year before, 7-6. I think that this team, to me, the schedule's similar, maybe slightly harder than Oregon State, but I think it makes up for it. Again, like, you can't help but compare these two with the same win total and a similar schedule. They do go to Oregon State. They host Washington. They host Texas Tech. They go to Fresno State and Boise State. So it's tough to expect maybe as many wins, like on just looking at the schedule, counting wins. But I think that this Washington State team has a much higher floor. Like, I think Oregon State, there's a world where Oregon State's like god awful.
Yeah.
To me, Washington State, they'll be solid.
Yeah, well, and that out of conference schedule doesn't scare me, right? I mean, Washington, I sort of put in the same category as UCLA, where it's like, yes, they were good last year. We have no idea what to expect with them this
And that game's at home.
And it's even better. But you look at Washington. When we talk about Oregon State being gutted, Washington might be the poster boy for gutted. I mean, staff gone, everything is gone on that team. So we really don't know how good Washington is. Washington State very easily could they should at least keep that game competitive. So that could be a win. Texas Tech is always a wild card. I actually mentioned his name earlier, Zach Kitley, sort of ironically, right? So he's the OC at Texas. So it'll be sort of a reunion from between the two OCs, and I'm sure that'll be sort of a big game that each one has circled. So Washington State will give their best in that game too. So that out-of-conference schedule doesn't scare me maybe as much as some others. So Washington State is one that I think could probably sneak up on people.
Awesome. And there you go. There's the Mountain West and the Pac-2. Justin, I appreciate you, taking the time going through these both from a fantasy perspective and a betting perspective. Before I rattle off some best bets, and if you have any best bets, please plug all the work you're doing. You've been crushing it. I mean, if you're getting into college fantasy football, you should subscribe to Justin's Substack, Volume Pigs. I mean, the in-depth analysis on some of these both prospects or both players and also like offenses as a whole and how to project these teams is really like one of the few in the space for a growing community. So please plug all your work.
Yeah, no, and again, I appreciate you having me on. This is tons of fun. I would love to do it again anytime you want. So you mentioned it. Yeah, I have a website on Substack, www.volumepigs.com. It's linked in my Twitter profile, which I'll probably be tagged on this video. So you can find me at Volume Pigs. I also write at Campus to Canton, who are another sort of CFF college football content creator. And I also write articles at Fantrax, which is the app or website where you can find and play in CFF leagues. So as Reed mentioned it, my articles are very in-depth. We go into basically, we leave no stone unturned when we're looking at individual players, individual teams. So if you are interested in betting on college football outcomes, speculating in any sort of shape or fashion, I recommend taking a look.
Absolutely. And then for me, best bets, I got 3. So I'm taking Fresno State to win the conference plus 360. I think that I like their path to getting there, and I think they could stack up with Boise State. I'm also on Colorado State over 6.5 wins. That's minus 110 at FanDuel, and Utah State under 5.5 wins. That's minus 140 at Bet365. Justin, I know you're not necessarily in the betting space, and you said the win total is still kind of something you're working through. Any betting thoughts? It doesn't have to necessarily be like bet this win total, but maybe like play against these teams. Anything you want to share with us before you get out of here?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before the show, I generally do bet on over-unders each year, but currently, I mean, I usually start looking at that later in July, earlier in August. Maybe one sort of axiom or something I like to follow is usually those year two for these big regime changes. So Colorado State, you mentioned in one of your best bets there. That second year or that third year, in some cases can really be a big jump. Usually that first year, that transition year, people are really excited about something new. They want to play with the new shiny toy, but usually disappoints. It's that second year when everybody gets burned the first time, and then they sort of say, "Oh, forget about this team." That's when you kind of see that nice volume rebound. So that's just one kind of thing I sort of think about. But in terms of individual bets, I don't have anything yet. I'll have to come back on the show, I guess, later.
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely going to have you back on. You can find all the early read bets in the profile or the description below. You can find Justin's Substack. I'll link it inside the podcast description below. You can find my bets at my betstamp at RW33. My Twitter, of course, is at Reed Wallach. Justin is at Volume Pigs. Until our next preview, we're doing the AAC next, but great Mountain West preview. Conference previews roll on. Justin, like we said, got to have you on again soon.
No, thanks, and look forward to it.